Gentlemen, how old were you when you first committed to living alone? My housemate is moving out, and while I can cover the rent for the place, it feels financially irresponsible when I could be saving or investing that money. That said, I am also 30, and I feel like I cannot have a housemate forever. I am fed up with living with people. At what age did you do it, if at all? Story 1. I lived alone for the first time at 25. I do not like having roommates or other people in my house who do not share my habits. Cannot do that. If I need to work a little harder to pay the rent myself, I will always gladly do so. Story 2. At 23, assuming I mean truly on my own, I had a one-bedroom apartment in college, but my parents were still helping me out then. Somehow, that was cheaper than living in the dormitories. Story 3. At 28, I think I found myself. I found my confidence. I had a big ego when I was younger. The older I got, the more failures I experienced and the more stress I took on. The better I became, the more my ego diminished. My self-esteem and confidence took its place. I wouldn't change that for the world, in all honesty. Story 4. I was 19 years old. I had a small efficiency apartment in a house near the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. That was in 1969 to 1970. I paid $75 per month. It was great because it was on the first floor with the house's porch at my front door. It had a couch, a bed, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a big closet. Perfect. Story 5. I am 31 years old and cannot imagine living with a roommate. I have been living alone since I was 20. At this point, it is not socially acceptable to have roommates, in my opinion. Story 6. After 11 years of house shares, my first studio flat was at age 30. It was blissfully quiet but lonely. I went back to sharing at 33 with like-minded flatmates, then lived with my ex at 37 for a year. At 38, I moved out to a one-bedroom flat which was too expensive, then rented a couple of studios. That amounted to 28 years of renting, 18 of which were in London. The last studio I rented was very cheap for London, so I took advantage of it and saved hard for a deposit. At 47, last year, I bought my first property, a one-bedroom flat outside London. I have easily paid about £300,000 in rent over my life. I found that I was perfectly happy living on my own after my ex. I needed my own space and some quiet time, and I am happy living on my own now. Story 7. I moved out on my own when I was 17. My child was born when I was 18. Essentially, I have never really lived alone, but I was the only working adult in the household. Story 8. I had roommates throughout college and moved in with my ex right after college. Then she ended the relationship and moved out. Now I am living alone for the first time at 26. It feels strange and is definitely taking me a long time to get used to it. Story 934. It's kind of crazy when you think back to all the places you have lived and realize you have always had someone else there. Took a little while to get used to, but it has its perks too. Story 10. 25 years old, excluding college. 18 if including college. In the real world, 25. I lived with my parents for 2 years after college and paid off my loans. Once fully debt-free and with a fully funded emergency fund, I moved out. Story 11. I was 34 years old. The only way I will live with someone again is if I get married. Other than that, hard pass. The only negative of living alone is that all of the bills are your bills. Story 12. Between the military, college, and rooming with friends, there was not much need for my own place. I was also lucky that my roommates were always friends whose company I enjoyed, so having them as roommates was not taxing. Story 13. Technically, never. I moved out at 18, but I always had roommates. When I finished school and started working full-time, my girlfriend and I moved in together, and we have been together ever since. Story 14. I never really thought about it this way, but I have never lived alone. First with family, then with roommates, then with my girlfriend, and now I am married to her, so I guess I live with family again. Story 15. Moved out at 19, found a really affordable place to rent. Affordable enough to save a lot of money. I got a well-paid trade job, no student loans at all, made money from the first day. At 21, I bought a modest apartment with a mortgage. Story 16. I am 27 and still living with my parents. We moved to the United States a couple of years ago, but just checking the prices for a place for myself makes me keep living with them. I still want to have a place of my own to gain experience, and if I bring a girl home, she will not see my dad in the living room. Story 17. 61 and never lived on my own yet. I am as close to living on my own as possible since I share my house with a teenager. Story 18. I rented a one-bedroom apartment for $900 when I was about 24. I have been living alone ever since. Can get lonely at times, but it is peaceful, and I have my own freedom. Story 19, 26. And it was the best decision I have ever made. Having a space that is truly yours is a great feeling. Yes, it is more expensive, and I also live in a major city, but the last 3 years of living alone have been the best years. A lot of growth and positive changes occurred during this time. Story 20. I was 29. I lived with my college girlfriend when we left school. We got married, and I did not live alone until we separated. Story 21. This is going to sound crazy, but 41. I went from home with family to college with roommates to dating, engaged, married to someone, then bam, divorced. Let me tell you, the time I lived alone before I got remarried 5 years later was absolutely glorious. Story 22. 26? I think that's about right. I got married at 27, and she and I bought the house a year and a half prior, so yes, 26. After some remodels that were messy, I moved in, then she was supposed to move in after we got married. Story 23. I was 17 when I moved away to university and was very happy to have freedom. I had to be extremely responsible at a very young age and excelled at it, so I was eager to be able to make my own decisions. Story 24. I lived with roommates for 3 years after graduating from college and enjoyed the social aspects until the last year. Of course, it depends on the quality of the roommate, but my belief is that one can only tolerate another person's dirty dishes so many times. Once I reached that limit, I knew it was time to get my own place. I do not think there is a specific age that stands out as the maximum for having roommates, but if you have one in mind, use that. For reference, I moved into my bachelor pad about 5 months before I turned 28. Story 25. I took a job 4 hours from my parents and 90 minutes from the college town. I had a nice little flat 4 minutes from my job. It was the first time I had been completely on my own. It was awesome. Story 26. 34 out of 35. California is very expensive, and it took me a long time to find a job that paid me enough to avoid having roommates. Story 27. The normal age in Finland for that. It turned out that there was a dorm room available at the university, and it was a single-occupant room. It was tiny at 19 square meters, but it was not shared with anyone. Then again, there was a break to this soon as I went to the army, but I returned to a similar room later to finish my studies. Story 28. 17 unless you count being a latchkey kid, which started around age 13. By the time I finished college, I had more than my fill of dealing with roommates, so no more. As for shared living space, I generally want to limit that to close friends or trusted family members. Story 29. 20. Got bored really quickly, so I was always inviting people over. I like living with at least one other person. Story 30. I believe as soon as I was able to move out, I immediately started living on my own. I have never lived with either a roommate or girlfriend. I honestly would not even know where to go to look for a roommate if that was something I wanted to do. Story 31. I was able to afford an apartment right out of college for my first full year. It was better the following year to share expenses by moving in with my girlfriend, but after that relationship ended, I lived alone for several years. Story 32. At 27, I did not study for long or feel the need to live with roommates. I did like living with them because I love being with others. I hear people moving to different countries and having no problem leaving their parents behind, but I could never do that. Story 33. I moved out of my parents' house for the first time and had no desire for a roommate. It was occasionally challenging in terms of finances, but I made it work. My only regret is not moving out sooner. Story 34. 26 legitimately alone. Moved out for college at 18, but with dorms, off-campus housing, postgraduate housing, and so on, I always had roommates. Story 35. At 18, I moved to London for university. I come from a decent family that can support my daily needs easily, but I had the urge to take responsibility. I took a job at a coffee shop within 24 days of being in the country. I joined a gym, did well at university, and managed to make amazing friends. It has been 4 years now, and I still feel I have not been as productive as I was between 18 and 20. But we move forward. Story 36. Moved out alone at 24. Expensive? Yes. Peaceful? Also yes. There is something deeply empowering about walking into silence that is yours, making dinner in your underwear, and not worrying if your milk will still be there tomorrow. Story 37. Moved out for college and lived with unpleasant roommates in a dormitory for 6 months before I saved enough to live independently. I had to work full-time throughout my undergraduate studies, but it allowed me to live alone, which was more than worth it. Story 38. Jesus, this thread makes me sad. I am 32 and have only lived alone once at 24, mostly by choice until 3 years ago. I used to prefer having extra money and actually did not mind having roommates. The one time I lived alone, I hated it and did not like struggling to pay rent. But after being burned enough times by people deciding last minute not to renew the lease and getting a significant pay bump, I decided my time with roommates had passed. Then I lost my job and have been in a financial hellscape since. I probably will not be able to recover enough to sign a lease on my own for a few years after an AI land job. Story 39. Never have, always had roommates up until the time I got married to my wife. Financially, it does not make a lot of sense to live alone in my opinion. Story 40, 21. But times were different. If having a roommate allows you to start finding an individual retirement account or a 401k for your future, so be it. Story 41. I am 26 years old and still live with my friend from high school. I lived alone for a year when I was 20, and I was losing my mind. Apparently, growing up in a big family made me incapable of thriving in solitude. Story 42. At 25, getting my own place was fantastic. It wasn't the nicest apartment, but making it my own and not living with a bunch of random roommates was great. Story 43. If you count university dormitories, where I did not have a roommate but did share a kitchen with a few other students, then 18. If not, I shared apartments with roommates until I bought my own place at around 27. Story 44. I got my first apartment at 19, then bought my house at 24. I have been living here in my cozy little house on my small plot of land ever since. Story 45. 16 for me. I had it all planned out when I was 11 to move out as soon as I got a job at 16, and it worked out surprisingly well. I never looked back. I always remember the feeling of freedom on my first night in my new apartment, followed by the realization that I did not have a bed because it was delivered a week later. Story 46. If you mean when I moved out of my parents' house, I was 18. If you mean when I started living alone with no roommates, I was 23 or 24. Story 47. I was 19 years old when I moved 800 kilometers from my parents' city to study in a larger city. I lived in a small 12-square-meter student studio for a few years. I also lived with housemates for a short time during an internship in Brussels, but I largely prefer to have my own space. I became independent at 23, got my first job, and now I live in a 2-room 40-square-meter apartment. Story 48. I was on the streets at 13, hiding from police after being kicked out and reported as a runaway. I stayed mostly under bridges, in drainage areas, and under random houses. The first place of my own was a falling-apart trailer when I was 18. From about 19 years old, I have always lived with either a significant other or a roommate. I tried living alone, but relatives moved in and refused to leave. Living with roommates was a way to prevent that. Story 49. I was 29, but prior to that, I was paying the bills for myself, my mother, and her husband. It has been 2 years now, and I honestly do not know how anyone can enjoy not living alone. I personally think it all depends on your background. Story 50. I have never lived alone, but it is my greatest desire. I just cannot afford the rent on a studio apartment. Story 51. I did it for about 6 months when I was 21 or 22, then about the same length of time again when I was 23. I absolutely loved it both times, but first a friend, then a girlfriend, and now my wife needed roommates. It could certainly be lonely and is obviously more expensive, but the freedom is something everyone needs to experience. Story 52. I lived alone for 2 years when I was in my early 30s. It was expensive, inefficient, lonely, and unpleasant. I moved back in with roommates. Then, when I got together with my now wife, we moved in together. I hope to never live alone again. Story 53. I am 41 years old and have never lived alone. Until I was 18, I lived with my parents and siblings. Then I either lived in the military barracks or with a roommate in the United States Army. After that, I lived with my girlfriend, who became my wife. After the divorce, I got custody of our daughter, so I live with her now. One day, though, I will be an adult and live alone. Story 54. I will be getting my own place at 28 years old in about a month after living with roommates for the last few years. Story 55. I lived in a boarding school from age 16 to 17, spent 17 to 18 in juvenile detention, then went straight into a single dormitory in a community college from 18 to 20. I moved across the country and lived in a studio apartment from 20 to 22, then lived with a partner for 3 years, only to move back across the country almost 2 years ago and live with my parents again. I loved the freedom of living alone, and I am very ready to go back. But circumstances are circumstances. It does not matter if you are 18 or 30. It is never too late or too early to live on your own. It is just the cards you are dealt. Story 56. Right after college at 22, best experience ever, to be honest. I've done it all since. Random roommates, crazy random roommates, staying with my parents for a year. I will never live with someone again unless it's my future wife, and that's even debatable. Just kidding, future wife, if you ever see this. Story 57:19, but that is because I was in an apartment that my company paid for. Outside of that, I have always had a roommate or partner. Story 58. I lived alone once for 2 months, and it wasn't by choice. My roommate left me stranded while I was spending the night at a friend's. I was 22 at the time. After that, I always rented rooms because it was much cheaper. I think the most I ever paid was $525 per month for a room. I am pretty social, and all I ever did was work or stay at girls' places, so I didn't need anything fancy. Story 59. I married at 23 and moved to another country, from Europe to North America, with my wife when I was 24. I do not know if it counts, but I was the only one working and supporting myself and my wife while she was going to college. Also, I was sending money to my parents back home. Story 60. I am 19 years old. Currently, I am renting a studio for $500, utilities included. I am still getting used to it. Story 61. I moved out at 18, lived in a few house share properties for a few years, and then got my own place at 22. I have been living on my own ever since. I am nearly 42. I stayed at my sister's for a weekend a couple of months ago for a family gathering. I am so used to being on my own that I struggle to sleep because of other people walking around at night. Story 62. When I was 22 or 23, I lived in a modest, almost studio basement apartment with one big room plus a small kitchen for about $750 per month in today's dollars. I have found that I enjoy living with the right housemates and have lived with them for much of my life since then. I choose big places, so we basically always have our own floor with some shared communal spaces. I travel a lot for work, sometimes for up to 3 weeks at a time. Among other things, having someone around to keep an eye on the place and take care of the dog is worth it to me. Story 63. I went to college for a year, came back home, and lived with a friend for a short time. That relationship ended quickly. Then I lived with my parents for a while before eventually getting a job. I have been pretty much on my own ever since. Story 64. I figure I will be an outlier at this age, but I moved out of my parents' house in 2014 when I was 15 or 16. It was not for any real reason, and it was gradual. One day, my younger sister asked if she could have my room since I had left. My parents said, "Oh yes, where did you move to? We figured you were fine since you were here every day to pick up your sister, but we should probably talk about this." Story 65, 20. Lived alone for 8 years. Had to move back to help a family member and also because it is easier to save money. If I go back out, I want to live with a roommate. Story 66. I moved out of my parents' house at 18 but either had roommates or lived with girlfriends for a long time. Story 67. At 21, in a different continent, after witnessing my father pass away in front of my eyes, I managed to live alone somehow without spiraling into depression or anything. I was on scholarship and saved as much as possible, living on half the stipend. It was a student apartment, so rent was cheap. Story 68. But this was in a new town I moved to for my first job out of college. I realized after a year that I was not meeting anyone or making friends, and living by yourself is really expensive on a beginning of career salary. So I had roommates again for a few years to save money, got sick of roommates, lived by myself again for a year, realized it was still pretty tight financially, went back to roommates for a couple more years, then bought a house. I lived alone technically for a couple of years there, though my partner was over a lot. She moved in to be, hopefully, my last ever roommate. Story 69. I graduated with my Master of Business Administration at 22 and rented my first solo apartment at 23. My girlfriend, now wife, moved in when I was 25. I have only lived alone for 2 years in my whole life. Story 70. I am 45 years old and have never lived alone. I moved from my parents' house to my first apartment with my girlfriend, who is now my wife. Story 71. 17, but that was in college dorms, so not really alone. 19, when I got my first apartment. That is, if you do not count the month when I was 10 that my mom left me with a friend while she went out of town. The friend dropped me back off at home after a few days and left money for food. The 1980s were wild. No one called Child Protective Services. They just commented on how responsible and mature I was for my age. Story 72. From 24 onwards, I am now 33 years old. I lived with my parents throughout college and left at 23. Then I got an apartment with my brother and his wife for a year. Afterward, they bought a house and I bought a townhouse. It was a cheap area. The few single professionals who moved to that town were always excited that it was affordable enough not to need roommates. Since it was inexpensive, the locals who needed roommates were usually unreliable, and I definitely did not want to share important responsibilities with them. Therefore, I never really considered it. Story 73. I am 22 years old. I am currently in professional school. During undergraduate studies, I shared an apartment with 2 friends. I moved for professional school and have lived alone since. It is the best. I do not have to worry about being in the way or someone interrupting me. Story 74. It has been over a decade, and I never want to live with people again. Even having house guests I like for one night is a pain. I value my personal space, doing what I want when I want, and never waiting for the bathroom or worrying if the house is too cold for someone else. I would love to become a full hermit. Story 75. I lived by myself throughout college from age 18 to 22, but my parents were paying for my room and board. I have been living independently and supporting myself since age 22. I am currently 25. Story 76. I have never lived alone. From birth to 18, I lived at my parents' house. At 18, I joined the Navy and lived with 80 of my closest friends whom I had never met before. I was in an open bay barracks at submarine school, then at the technical school. I was on a submarine with 130 of my closest friends. Later, 3 buddies and I rented a house while continuing to go to sea. I got married and bought a new house with my wife. Then the kids started showing up until we had 3 of them. They grew up and moved out on their own, leaving my wife and me empty nesters for the last 20 years. So, it has never been just me. Story 77. The first time I was 20. I joined the army. I came back home after the army and it took me another year to get back on my own. I have not had to go back since 2011. Story 78. Literally the day after I graduated high school, I couldn't get out of my mom's house fast enough. I still remember the first night, having only a box spring and a mattress, some snacks in the kitchen, and a small TV on a milk crate that had channel numbers burned into the screen. I cranked the air conditioning up to Arctic cold levels. Laid on the mattress I had bought from a classified ad for $150, and just smiled to myself in independent bliss. That studio apartment was tiny, overpriced, and not in a great area, but it was mine. Even 25 years later, I still have very fond memories of it and that first night. Story 79. I was 31 when my last grandmother passed away. I still miss her. We had a close relationship. I bought groceries and worked on the house. Story 80. I had a roommate in college at first, but he dropped out and I was on my own from then on. The first couple of weeks felt strange, and I was a little scared to live alone, but once I got over that, it was amazing. Story 81. At 21, I moved an hour away from home with my friend for a year, then moved back home for another 2 years. We no longer talk because of it. Story 82. I used to live with my grandma. Later, when I got a job, I chose to leave my grandparents' house. I still visit them, though. Story 83. A week before I turned 21. I lived alone until I was about 27. Once I was close to 33, I started living alone again. I briefly lived with someone in 2019 for a few months while I was figuring out relocating, but other than that, I have been living alone ever since. That assumes pets do not count. If pets do count, I had a cat born in 2009 who lived with me until she passed in November 2024. So you could say I was not living alone between June 2009 and November 2024. Story 84. It was only for a month, though. Then my friend started renting a room. By rent, I mean he paid the gas bill. Story 85. I started living alone when I was 18. I am currently 24. I shared an apartment for 6 months with my best friend, but she currently lives in another state. She came to live with me as I was already living alone during that 6-month period, and it was really good. Living alone is very difficult, expensive, and lonely, but at the same time, liberating and indispensable. Story 86. I moved out at 18 when I left for film school. I lived alone in a small studio for 4 years until I finished school. Then I moved elsewhere. I had my first girlfriend, with whom I had a long-distance relationship, stay over for a month at a time sometimes. Then my second girlfriend slept over quite often, but I still lived alone. Story 87. After living with someone who almost killed my cat, I didn't know he was a troubled person when he moved in and lied about having a job. I went to university late. From age 28 to 30, I had a few roommates who were all right. There was an older couple who rented out 2 rooms, and everyone was mature, clean, and easy to get along with. I live alone now but plan to buy a house soon. I will probably rent out a furnished room on a short-term lease to trade students since the college is within walking distance. At least I will have some control over who moves in, and it will be easy to ask them to leave if they are not suitable or just wait out their semester. Story 88. 19. But I do not think going home to recruit training, then to advanced training, then to living on a ship counts. I had a barracks room with a roommate and shortly after, I was married. I do not think I ever lived alone now thinking about it. Story 89. Oh man, if you are 30, just have to cut the roommate ties already. I could not imagine having a roommate after my mid-20s. It is probably a different situation, but you will feel as free as a bird, especially if you can afford it. Story 90. I was living with my mother in Florida. Then she had to go to China to open a factory. I was a straight A student. My grades dropped to almost all F grades within 3 months. I was skipping school and partying every day. Then I got arrested at school and was expelled from the county. Those were the best times of my life. Story 91. On my 18th birthday, I got kicked out of the house. One of the best things that happened to me, honestly. It was a wake-up call, and I learned quickly the value of hard work. Story 92. 22 and still have not. Lived with roommates at college in dormitories and off campus, and now share an apartment at graduate school. Story 93. I moved to my first apartment when I was 19. I had 2 roommates. I shared with diverse people until the coronavirus pandemic, when I had 28 roommates. I moved to live alone when I was 29 to 30 years old. Story 94. I am 14 going on 15. My mom and dad separated when I was 10. At that time, my brother, who was 17, needed to go to college. My mom worked in the metro. I had a choice to live with my grandparents in another province, but I chose to live in our house. Child support is not well regulated in third world countries. Up until now, I am 26 and still living alone. Story 95. I was 21, fresh out of the Air Force, and got a job at Coleco making computers in 1983. It was a different time and place compared to today. Story 96. I did it for a few years. At 24, I had housemates before that. It wasn't really worth it. I worked 10 hours a day and had to do everything myself. I had no time off trying to cover expenses alone, and what little time I did have was spent keeping the house in order. I live with roommates now, and sharing the load of survival is much easier. We can actually save money, and if anyone loses their job, we can manage while they find work. When I lived alone, missing one paycheck would have led to eviction before too long. Story 97. At 17, I moved out of my parents' house. At 19, I was alone. It was tough, but it taught me how to really cook, be financially responsible, and be independent. It made me stronger. Sometimes I miss the alone time, but living with my husband and my dog is 1,000 times better. Story 98. Technically, I was 20 or 21 because we did not get roommates at my college dorms during the pandemic. However, if you exclude that instance, it would be 23 for me. Story 99. I started living alone when I was 20. I moved back in with my mother and had roommates between the ages of 22 and 25. I went back to living alone from 25 to 26. It can be, for lack of a better word, lonely at times, but I mostly enjoy living by myself. Story 100. Sometimes with family, at university for 2 years with roommates, 2 years alone, probably 18 back then. Then alone at job with roommates, now with girlfriend. Story 101. Probably 32. I have had roommates before, all the way back to leaving home for the first time. Since then, I have always lived alone. Story 102. Alone? Never. I moved out with my girlfriend and away from my parents at 22. I am 24 now, and between now and 25, I will be living alone at some point. Story 103. 46. Previously had flatmates, then married, now separated. I have my teenager with me, but as he is not really contributing to the day-to-day running of the house or many chores, I take that as living alone. Love it. Story 104. Lived with my parents until 25. Had roommates and then was married until 37. I did not live on my own until age 37 and have been on my own since then and love it. Story 105. 19. After I returned from basic training and my parents moved out of state. After 20 years of marriage, I am grateful to be living alone again. Story 106. I am Generation X, so it may have been easier then to live alone, but it was one of the best decisions I ever made. Constant struggles with finding good housemates were a nightmare. Story 107. In my case, never. I went from living with my parents to a college dorm, then to a shared flat, followed by an awesome shared house, and finally moving in with my now wife. Luckily, I generally had good people to stay with. The shared house co-inhabitants were the entourage at each other's weddings. Story 108. After college, I was determined not to have roommates anymore. I lived in a terrible part of town but found the nicest area within it. It was such a revelation. Story 109. I was still in high school and it was glorious. Edit. I cannot read. That was when I moved out, around age 21 when I had my first apartment alone. Glory 2.0. Story 110. 32. Got divorced and was living alone for the first time. I am fortunate my mortgage is not too bad, but I scrape by. I would rather scrape by than have to deal with a roommate. Story 111. I was 26 when I finally moved out of my home and into my first space. I never had a roommate and did not want one. Took me 1 year to learn how to make it work, and I loved it. It taught me how to be responsible while still keeping a plan with my income. It is a key stage in your growth as a man, so the sooner you can do it, the better. Story 112. Moved to a new country at 22 all by myself. I lived with roommates for about 2 years until finally moving to my own little studio apartment at 24. It was really a blessing, but at times the loneliness hits too. Well, it has its pros and cons. I have only lived alone for 16 months and cannot complain. Story 113. In 1990, in New York City, I was making $17,000 a year working full-time in a food chain warehouse in Brooklyn. I rented a one-bedroom apartment for $400 a month. The plan was originally to move in with a friend, but he opted out. I owned a car and was paying $120 a month for car insurance. Inflation is difficult. Story 114. The first and only time I truly lived alone, I was 22 to 23 years old. Just me, my 2 dogs, and 2 cats for about a full year, maybe a little longer. After about a year, I started renting out my house and moved in with some friends for a year, as it was closer to my work and convenient for all of us. Then I bought a camper to travel and lived in it for about 3 months before my now husband and I discovered I was pregnant. I sold my rental home. I had bought it at 20 with no help, just worked very hard since I was 13. We then bought our first home together and now live in our second home with 2 kids. That year alone was peaceful. My advice? Do your best to enjoy it. What I would not give for just 3 hours to myself. Story 115. You should never live alone. Either get married or have roommates. Living by yourself does not make sense. Story 116. At 18, I moved out for university and lived with roommates. At 21, I lived with my girlfriend. After we broke up, I moved out by myself. Story 117. Except for living in residence during my first year of college, I have never lived alone. I am nearly 50 now. Story 118. 42. By technicality because I had not turned 43 yet. My wife and I moved in together straight out of school. When she passed in 2021, I still had my son and daughter living with me. My eldest daughter was already in university. Now my youngest is off to university, so it is just me and the dog. Story 119. When I was 22, I purchased a recreational vehicle and took it somewhere where I could rent it. I was trying to get an apartment, but being 22, it was going to be hard, especially while going to school. So right now, I live in my recreational vehicle. I consider it a home. It is small, but I am alone with no one to share it with, which is a pro. Story 120. I was 16 and had joined medical school. The first 2 days were numb. From the 3rd day, I started feeling extremely homesick. I cried a lot in the bathroom. I did not feel good at all. Slowly, over the next 6 months, things changed. But yes, I was very scared and wanted to run away. Story 121. At 19, I moved into a student house for university and was the only occupant for several months. After university, I lived with friends for 2 years, then moved back home for a year before getting my own place. Story 122. When my parents told me I had to pay rent, I found a cheaper apartment and have not looked back. Story 123. 27. It was right after I moved out from my parents' place and started my first job after graduate school. I never liked sharing my space with others, so spending a little extra for my own place and compromising in other areas was the best decision I have ever made. Story 124. I have never lived alone, actually. I never really thought about it, but I went from living with family to being married and living with my wife. Story 125. I got my first apartment when I was 17. I was evicted for living a reckless lifestyle. From that day, I learned to live independently. Story 126. Moved into my own apartment at 16. It was a small, unpleasant place where I lived for a couple of years before I joined the army. Story 127. I lived alone for about a year until COVID hit. It got lonely because I couldn't go to university and lived 11 hours away from my family, so I couldn't see them either. I moved into shared housing after this to cope with the loneliness during that time. Now I am 24 and living alone again. Absolutely loving it since I can see people during the day, either friends or colleagues at work, then come home and relax by myself. I couldn't imagine living with anyone else, not even a partner, at this point. I love my alone time. Story 128. At 18, I moved out and rented a trailer, eventually buying it. It was great. Lot rent was only $150 a month, and utilities were very inexpensive. I kind of got spoiled by it, but I got married at 29, and we bought a small house together. Story 129. Considering college does not really count, though I had an apartment for 2 years by myself. I lived alone at 23 when I got my first job. Story 130. My parents had divorced. My father moved out the year before. As soon as I graduated high school, my mother and youngest brother moved out. There I was alone in the house. It was one great party time that summer. Then Dad wanted to rent the house, so I got an apartment in a bigger town. Story 131. I am 44 years old and have never lived alone. I had a roommate for my first apartment. I met a girl while living there, and when my roommate moved out, the girlfriend moved in. We have been together for 25 years, still live together, and have a family. I guess I might live alone someday, but I will probably be fairly old. Story 132. First was around 21 or 22, but I am not sure it fully counted. I had my own place, but my dad lived in the same building a few doors down. He had helped me get the place when I moved back to my hometown. As for actually living alone, it was at the start of this year. I was living with my mom and taking care of her, but she passed away in January. Story 133. I was 18 when I wanted a motorcycle. My parents said I would never own one while living in their house. I moved out and got my Harley Davidson. Story 134. My family moved into a new home and allowed me to rent the small older one from them until it was eventually sold. 10 out of 10 great time. For whatever reason, I outright refused to move my bed into the old parents' room. Story 135. I was 21 when I studied abroad for college, but I was not financially independent. I was 25 when I was briefly financially independent during the summer because I was not paying tuition, but my stipend could cover rent, food, and utilities. I was 28 when I got a full-time job in a different city. Story 136. I got a degree because everyone told me to. I hated it and went back into trades, which I enjoyed more. I moved to a different city for a management opportunity, and now I hate my life again. Story 137. I was 18. In hindsight, I was not really prepared for it. The boredom, the chores, shopping, cooking, cleaning. These menial tasks that you never thought twice about suddenly take a huge portion of your time. Came home from a shift and forgot to cook in advance? Guess it is instant noodles time because food delivery is too expensive. But it is not all bad. Waking up and going to sleep at your own leisure, not having anyone tell you what to do, bringing your own guests, and of course, the peace of a good night's sleep without anyone else waking you up. That is the one I miss most. Story 138. 4 days after my graduation from high school, I started college in a small, efficient apartment. I was walking onto the football team, and the apartment building was right beside the practice field. I was 18. Story 139. Due to personal circumstances and living in a very expensive state, it took me several years to afford a place with a roommate. It was not until about the age of 34 that my job reached the point where I could actually afford to live by myself. Story 140. At 28, I had been feeling the pull for a couple of years already. Living with someone is enjoyable until you have your life socially handled. And then you think, no, I need some space now. Story 141. Wow, Americans do move out early. Most people in my home country do not move out until they marry, if they marry at all. It is even normal for many generations to live in the same household. My parents and I used to live with my great-grandmother and my grandfather's sister when I was a child. We do not move for university because universities do not provide places for you to stay. There is no concept of roomie. Story 142. Actually, never. I had roommates after moving out of my parents' house. I moved in with my boyfriend, who is now my husband. Now we are just here. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.